Find a photo of yourself from 7 years ago. Really think about it. The clothes, the face, the way you were standing, the things you were worried about that week, the people you thought you could not live without, the version of the future you were certain was coming. Now here is the part that should unsettle you slightly. That person is not just gone in the way that time passes and things change. That person is gone in a way that is far more literal than most people ever stop to consider. The body in that photograph, at the cellular level, has been almost entirely replaced. The atoms that built that face, those hands, that particular arrangement of matter that walked around calling itself you, most of them are somewhere else now. In the air, in the ground, in other living things. What is sitting here reading this is a different physical object than the one in that photograph. And the question that should follow from that, the one that science and philosophy have been arguing about for centuries without resolution, is whether it is also a different person. Most people have heard some version of the 7-year rule. The idea that every cell in your body is replaced every 7 years, leaving you with an entirely new body on a regular schedule. It is one of those facts that gets passed around at dinner tables and in self-help books as a tidy metaphor for reinvention. The problem is that it is not quite true, and the reality is considerably stranger than the simplified version. Different cells in your body operate on completely different timescales. Some of them replace themselves in days, others last for decades, and a small number of them, the ones sitting inside the most important structure you own, may last your entire lifetime without ever being replaced at all. In the early 2000s, Swedish biologist Jonas Frisen developed a method for dating the age of individual human cells using carbon-14, the same radioactive isotope used to date archaeological artifacts. What he found dismantled the neat 7-year story entirely and replaced it with something far more interesting. The cells lining your stomach, the ones in direct contact with acid and food every day, live for roughly 5 days before being replaced. The cells on the surface of your skin last about 2 weeks. Your red blood cells circulate for approximately 4 months before being broken down and rebuilt. The cells in your liver, long assumed to be relatively stable, turn over on a cycle of somewhere between 150 and 500 days, depending on their specific function. Your muscle cells last somewhere around 15 years. And your bones, the structures most people think of as permanent and unchanging, are in a constant state of slow demolition and reconstruction, with most bone cells replaced over a cycle of roughly 10 years, though some last considerably longer. By the end of a decade, almost nothing in your skeleton is original material. You are not wearing the same bones you were born with. You are wearing a copy of a copy of a copy, rebuilt from whatever raw materials were available each time. But here is the part that changes the question entirely. Frisen's research found that certain neurons in the cerebral cortex, the outer layer of your brain responsible for thought, memory, language, and consciousness, appear to be as old as you are. They do not regenerate. They do not replace themselves. The neurons you are using right now to process these words were most likely formed before you were born, in the months when your brain was assembling itself in the womb. They have been with you every single day of your life. Every experience you have ever had, every memory, every version of yourself you have cycled through has been processed by cells that have never been replaced. Which creates a paradox that no one has cleanly resolved. Your body is almost entirely rebuilt on a rolling schedule. Your brain is running on original hardware. You are simultaneously a completely different physical object than you were 10 years ago, and a continuous thread of original neural tissue that has never been replaced. Both things are true. Neither one fully answers the question of what you actually are, because the cells are only part of the story. What happens to your brain over 7 to 10 years is not just a question of which cells survive and which are replaced. It is a question of how the connections between them change. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience, means that even the neurons that never get replaced are not static. Every skill you learned, every relationship that shaped you, every trauma that left a mark, every habit you built or broke, physically altered the structure of your neural connections. The synapses between neurons strengthen or weaken based on use. Pathways that are traveled frequently become faster and more efficient. Pathways that are abandoned thin out and eventually disappear. The brain you have today is not the same brain you had 7 years ago, even though many of its individual cells are the same, because the map of connections between those cells has been redrawn by everything that has happened to you since. This is where the science connects to something that most people have felt but struggle to articulate. The sense, usually arriving sometime in your late 20s or 30s, that you are genuinely not the same person you were at 20. not just older, not just more experienced. Actually different in ways that feel structural rather than superficial. Research into personality change over time supports this, feeling with data that surprises most people, because the popular understanding of personality treats it as essentially fixed. You are an introvert, or you are not. You are conscientious, or you are not. These things feel like facts about you rather than temporary configurations. But large-scale longitudinal studies tracking the same individuals over decades have found that personality, measured across the standard dimensions of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, changes substantially over the course of a lifetime, and not randomly. The changes follow patterns. People tend to become more conscientious and agreeable as they move through their 30s. Neuroticism, the tendency toward anxiety and emotional instability, typically decreases with age. Openness to experience shifts in complex ways that vary significantly between individuals. The person you are at 25 and the person you are at 45 share a name, a history, and a continuous thread of memory. They do not necessarily share a personality. In measurable, documented ways, they are different people wearing the same face. This is the point where philosophy steps in with a problem it has been unable to solve since ancient Greece: the ship of Theseus. The story goes like this. Theseus had a ship. Over time, as planks rotted and broke, they were replaced one by one with new planks. Eventually, every single plank in the ship had been replaced. The question is whether it is still the same ship. And then someone collected all the old planks and built a second ship from them. Now, which one is the original? The thought experiment was designed to ask what makes a thing the thing that it is. Is identity a question of material continuity, the same atoms in the same arrangement? Is it a question of functional continuity, the same shape performing the same purpose? Is it something else entirely, a pattern, a narrative, something that persists through change rather than despite it? For a ship, the question is philosophical but not urgent. For a person, it is something you live inside every day. The you that exists now shares almost no original cellular material with the you of 15 years ago. The neural connections that define your thinking have been substantially rewired. Your personality has measurably shifted. Your memories of who you were have been reconstructed so many times they barely resemble the original recordings. In what sense are you the same person? And more importantly, does the answer to that question change anything about how you move forward? Here is what the evidence taken together actually suggests. Identity is not a fixed point. It is not a thing you have or lose or find. It is a process, a river rather than a rock. The continuity that makes you you is not the continuity of matter, because the matter keeps changing. It is not the continuity of personality, because that changes too. It is something more like the continuity of a story being told by an editor who is always working with new material, always revising the earlier chapters in light of what came later, always building toward an ending that keeps moving as you move toward it. The 7-year rule is a myth, but the truth it is gesturing at is real. You have been rebuilt repeatedly at every level, from the molecular to the psychological. The person in that old photograph is gone in ways that go deeper than memory or sentiment, and the person reading this now will be gone too, replaced gradually and without ceremony by whoever you are still in the process of becoming. That is not a loss. It is the mechanism. You are not a fixed thing that time is wearing down. You are a process that time is still building. The question was never whether you would change. The question is whether you are paying attention to who you are changing into.